We're not going to go through detailed introductions other than to say that we're going to be led off by Friso Vosen from Tilburg, then followed by Gemma Petri from Mozilla, and Alexandra Destriel from the University of Namur, who also does a lot of work with Sarah. And so, Friso, the platform's yours.
Great, so I should have some slides if those are coming. Yeah, okay. I think the time to also, well, thank the organizers for putting up such an amazing conference and the kind invitation to me to present some work in progress. It's something new. This is the first time I'm presenting it with some trepidation, but it is about ecosystem entanglement. And I hope I've convinced you by the end that this is a thing that maybe we should think about more because the DMA doesn't really regulate it, but it kind of stands in the way of what the DMA seeks to achieve, which is contestability of core platform markets. So let's maybe jump right in with what I mean by this ecosystem entanglement. I think there's a meaningful vignette to show what I mean. It's happened at Macworld 1997 in Boston, where Steve Jobs had just come back to Apple to save it from bankruptcy and general decline. And for that, it called upon the help of Bill Gates at Microsoft. And Microsoft then committed to invest $150 million in Apple to save it from that bankruptcy, but also perhaps more importantly, to provide its Office suite with full feature parity for at least 5 years for the Mac operating system. And in graciously accepting that investment and offer, Steve Jobs said something interesting about the nature of competition. Well, he said basically that competition between Apple and Microsoft was over as far as he was concerned. So this is basically what I mean. Investments from one platform or ecosystem orchestrator into another, not just investments financially, but also the provision of key complements to each other's ecosystem, and the way that could soften competition. This Apple-Microsoft example is definitely not the only one. I'm trying to click through slides, but that's not working very well. Perhaps I'm doing something wrong, or yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, that works. So Apple and Microsoft is not really an exception. Apple and Google have also been very cozy. CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, was on the board of Apple for a number of years when Apple was developing the iPhone and Google was developing Android, so meaningful years. Apple launched the iPhone with just 2 apps that were not made by Apple, namely Google Maps and YouTube, so both by Google. And that was at a time when the iPhone didn't have an app store, so those apps were meaningful. Microsoft has also invested in Facebook and for a couple of years provided it with its ad system when it itself can do so at scale. So these investments and especially this provision of key complements is, definitely not unique or rare. It's been researched under some forums with other nice names, such as Co-opetition. Brandenburger and Neleva wrote a whole book about that. Frenemy relationship. And in a way, you could say, well, maybe this is just common in ecosystem because an ecosystem is made up of a core platform with a bunch of complements for that platform. So it's only logical that some of these complements might come from another ecosystem, even the very important ones. Although, from how I understand the business strategy literature, that's not ideal. You actually would want to avoid such entanglement. If that complement is indeed key to provide value for consumers, you'd have to share the rents with that other ecosystem provider. And of course, you'd also be subject to a threat of withdrawal, of opportunistically withdrawing that complement to, I guess, foreclose, draw some users to the ecosystem that was providing that complement. So in general, it might be something that you want to avoid. And indeed, some ecosystems over time at least avoid it. Replacement of those key complements does happen. Apple Maps came in as a replacement for Google Maps. Apple also came up with the iWork suite as perhaps not a replacement, at least a backup for Office. But other times it doesn't happen. Wow. I'm a bit jet lagged, okay? Anyway, the example of that is, of course, the Apple-Google search agreement, which was put in place also in 2007 at the launch of the iPhone and has been in place since, for those, I don't want to do maths now, 18 years. Now, what is the effect of that provision of key complements? Of course, soften competition in one very direct way. The fact that Apple won't build its own search engine when it's being paid $20 billion a year by Google. But I think more importantly, or at least less recognized, it also has ripple effects on the broader competition between these different gatekeepers. The DMA has now opened up iOS to some extent, but Google hasn't made any steps to, for example, build a Chrome web browser that is not based on Apple's browser engine WebKit. And that could be real competition to host web apps and compete with Apple's App Store, let alone that it would launch its own Play Store on iOS, which it could. But maybe to protect that cozy relationship they have in the search markets, wouldn't want to put these declarations of war basically to Apple, as some have called them. Now, this is a problem for the DMA, as its goal is contestable markets. And who's going to contest these core platform markets? I think the strongest challengers, the most capable ones, are likely other gatekeepers. If anyone's going to build another search engine, I think it's going to be either, well, Microsoft expanding Bing or Apple coming up with a capable search engine. For different reasons. Of course, these are the firms that have access to some of the crucial building blocks, a web index, as has been mentioned. Microsoft's the only other firm, except for Google, has a more or less fully fledged one. Apple has something of an index as well. Well, the financial heft to invest and build such a search engine. Also importantly, the users that they could channel when the complement is subject to network, or here specifically for search, learning effects. It's good that you could, well, install your own search engine, say as a default, get a lot of users to use it, and then learn from that data, improve it. So these are all kind of unique, or at least rare, advantages that gatekeepers have to compete in these core platform markets. And the DMA, I think, is open to such rivalry. Nothing prohibits one gatekeeper from relying on DMA obligations to compete with another gatekeeper. I mean, this could have been prohibited as it is in the Data Act. The Data Act also has data sharing obligations, and it specifically excludes from the potential beneficiaries other gatekeepers. So other gatekeepers cannot rely on data sharing by between each other. So that's important, but that's not what the DMA did. So the DMA, I think, to some extent recognizes that gatekeepers are perhaps each other's most capable challengers, but that rivalry, as I argued, is inhibited by this entanglement. So the DMA also doesn't really offer a solution to entanglement because it regulates ecosystems internally. For example, you can't self-preference, you can't give preferential treatment to your own complements. You can perfectly preferentially treat another gatekeeper's complements. This is clear also in the choice screen obligation. Gatekeepers in operating system markets have to show a choice screen in some key complement markets, browsers, search engines, AI agents, or virtual assistants, because as somebody rightly pointed out, AI is not in the DMA, but virtual assistants essentially means AI agents. So for each of these, you have to show a choice screen, but only if you're also a gatekeeper in that specific service. So that's why Apple has to show a choice screen for browsers, but not for search engines, because it uses, as a default, Google search engine. So that's, I think, a real limitation, because you won't get a choice screen where perhaps it matters most. You could think about adapting the DMA to deal with that, maybe amend it either in specific obligations, or maybe include some kind of entanglement provision saying, well, if you give default placement to another gatekeeper's complement, that counts as your own for the obligations. And then all of a sudden, indeed, Apple would have to show a choice screen for search engines. Or you could shift enforcement more fundamentally towards sort of accepting that gatekeepers are not going to be each other's strongest challengers, and focus the enforcement towards compliance that benefits startup challengers rather than gatekeepers. Also an option. Or you could look at also at antitrust law, which of course still complements the DMA. Because what I think is at the basis of this entanglement is sort of a collusive mechanism. I mean, take again the Google-Apple deal. I think what sustains that is that each company gets a nice share of, in this case, a monopoly profit from search, which I guess is higher than what they would expect in a duopoly, where they would compete with each having a search engine. So that's what has kept this so stable over the 18 years that has been in place. The ripple effects then kind of relates to the idea of collusion with multi-market contacts, which, as we know, can help sustain collusion. Now, is this collusive in the sense of Article 101 or Section 1 of the Sherman Act? I think it can be, certain forms at least. You've got sort of two big buckets of analysis here. Is it restrictive by object in the EU or per se in the US? I think anything that resembles a pay-for-delay scheme is, under current law, or at least should be. I think you can analyze the Apple-Google deal as a bit of a pay-for-delay scheme. I mean, we know these schemes from the pharmaceutical sector where the manufacturer of an original drug pays off a generic manufacturer not to enter the market. I think in some way that's the same mechanism at play. We also had the Google Meta Jedi Blue agreement, which seemed like something similar. We won't know because the investigations were halted based on enforcement priorities. But the allegation there was that Meta was about to put its weight behind header bidding, a technology that was a threat to Google, but then instead got a sweet deal within Google's ad systems instead. So that's the pay for delay kind of mechanism that should probably be restrictive, considered restrictive by object. Then there's things that are a bit more ambiguous in terms of their effects on competition, which should probably be subject to an effects analysis or rule of reason analysis. Any type of joint venture that is productive, as in where the two gatekeepers are actually producing something together, a new or improved product. There has been some interesting precedents here. For example, compared the Google-Yahoo joint venture that was at one point suggested with that of Microsoft-Yahoo. Both were doing something at least partially pro-competitive because Yahoo was about to leave the market, so it was kept alive by a more capable search engine. But the question was whether that should be Google versus Microsoft, and both the DOJ and the European Commission came to the conclusion that it at least shouldn't be Google, because then we'd go to, and again, more of a monopoly scenario, while with Microsoft, you're sort of propping up the potential duopolist. AI partnerships are a more current example that you probably have to view through that lens. Now, I'll skip to the last part, the most difficult part. If this is indeed a problem and perhaps even, or I think likely in some forms at least illegal, what do you do about it? And then we get to the remedy question, which is, in practice at least, the most difficult one, I think. The remedy of choice in digital markets, the quintessential remedy has been a choice screen. Talked a bit about those. And of course, there's a lot to be said about their design, and we'll hear about that soon. But I think one fundamental problem with this is that they cannot be shown where they matter most. We had the Google Android decision in the EU in 2018, which was focused, well, as the name implies, only on Android. So there was a choice screen then on Android. So I think the case was set up and by thinking ahead to the remedy, the Commission knowing that it could only compel Google to show a choice screen, of course, within its own operating system. The US was a bit better here because they also included the default placement agreements with Apple, in addition to those with Android phone makers. But the problem there was that they brought it as a monopolization case. So now in the remedy phase of the trial, they can only impose remedies on Google because Apple is not a party here, which I think might be a bit of a mistake, because that means that, you know, on 50% of phones, we won't see any choice screen. You can see that also in the DOJ's proposed remedies. They only propose a choice screen on the Chrome browser, which of course is in control of Google, so could be used for showing a choice screen. What I maybe suggest as an alternative, and this needs some further operationalization, but it is enemy remedies. I mean, if the problem that I've sketched is that these ecosystems are maybe a bit too cozy with each other, I guess too friendly with each other, the remedy should set them up as enemies, hence enemy remedies. I think we've seen the model of this in action with the Google-Apple mapping battle. This erupted in 2012 when at one point Google stopped offering feature parity of its Google Maps on iOS. So it wouldn't offer turn-by-turn navigation, which was then a big and useful innovation, to its Google Maps app on iOS. I guess hoping that that would draw some users to Android. Now, Apple reacted in kind and ditched Google Maps in favor of Apple Maps. This was a painful process for both companies. I guess competition is painful. Tim Cook had to publicly apologize for how bad Apple Maps was and fired the executive. Google Maps immediately lost 60% of its usage on iOS. So that goes to show that distribution advantage. But I think all in all, today we're much better for it. We have a duopoly in mapping instead of a monopoly. And I hear more and more people saying that Apple Maps is even better than Google Maps these days. So that's definitely a plus. The question, of course, is how do we emulate something like that with remedies? It's not easy, but probably the first step is framing some of these cases, not as monopolization, but as collusion. So you can have a grip on both firms that are entangled. Then an obvious step is to disentangle them. This is also very much part of the proposed remedies in the US v. Google case. Of course, you prohibit any agreements between these two ecosystems that would privilege a complement, in this case, search. But I'm trying to think through what would happen then if Apple can't install Google as default, or at least Google can't pay Apple to do so. I suppose Apple might very well just go to Microsoft, and probably they'll only get 50% of that 20 billion. At least that was sort of the offer Microsoft made before. So that's also not entirely, not the best outcome. Perhaps you could give it an extra push by saying that if Apple is indeed one of the parties in the case, a collusion case, the Apple can't contract with anyone for the provision of this specific complement, mainly being search. At that point, of course, its only option would be to develop its own search engine, and that is, in an ideal world, I think the outcome you would want to see, some serious search and some serious search competition from the one firm that might be able to do it. Of course, it's kind of out there. You'll have to think about, well, within a remedy framework, proportionality and all that. There are some legal limits there, but it's worth thinking about anyway. Sort of go, again, from a monopoly to a duopoly, as we've seen with apps, mapping apps specifically. There are some other things you can think about, such as to increase the number of enemies, and then we get to divestitures. I think one interesting aspect there is that, of course, divestitures are proposed and have been discussed, but usually with line of business restrictions. For example, you cut off, you divest Android, but you don't let it then enter browsers or search. I think maybe it's more interesting to not impose any line of business restrictions, so that you would create an enemy not just in this case operating systems for Android, but also that it could over time come up with its own browser, its own search engine, and so on. So as to increase number of players rather than sort of divvying up the market between the different players that you've structurally separated. In the last minute, I'll deal with some counter arguments, and there are certainly many more, but one of them is, well, is this not just strengthening ecosystems, where previously you had Apple, which had, an operating system and 40 of the complements for it. Now they also have a search engine on top of that. I think that's true and fair, but maybe the sort of this disadvantage of Apple growing another limb doesn't weigh up against the advantage of having true competition in search, perhaps. The other more pragmatic counter argument that we hear also now from Apple is that we won't do it. We won't build a search engine, whatever you tell us. But that seems rather unlikely. I mean, especially if you also prohibit them from, bargaining off the default placement in Safari to Microsoft or indeed any other search company. the only logical thing for them to do would be to build their own search engine and profit from it in that way, to perhaps not to tune of 20 billion per year, but certainly a nice sum. So those are some counter arguments, but I'm sure you'll have many more, which I'm excited to hear. Thank you.
And extra points for being right on on the nose at 20 minutes. That's a subtle hit.
I'll do my best. That's kind of in the middle of the presentation. Yeah. Okay. Little preview. All right. Okay. Thank you. So hi, everybody. My name is Gemma Petrie, and I'm a principal researcher at Mozilla. And unlike many of the speakers today, I don't have a background in law or in economics, but I have spent years studying how people interact with technology. So I'm going to talk to you today about how user research can help us design better competition remedies. So we know that regulators work hard to promote fair competition in digital markets. But when it comes to competition remedies, implementation is often left to the very companies that are being regulated. And unsurprisingly, the intended impact often falls short. Right. So I spend most of my time focused on competition research these days. But before that, I spent years leading the Firefox user research team. I know firsthand that tech companies invest significant resources into testing and refining ideas before they reach users. Yet when it comes to competition remedies, we often skip this important step. So my message today is that if we want competition remedies to be effective, especially those that involve user interface design, we need to treat them like any other user-facing technology and integrate user research into their development. So Mozilla has seen our fair share of browser choice screens over the years. We know from experience that simply requiring one is not effective. If it's poorly designed, disruptive, confusing, or easy to dismiss, most people won't engage with it. There's a really wide range of research methods that can be applied at different stages of remedy development. I'm going to share 3 complementary approaches today from Mozilla's research: concept testing, behavioral experiments, and usability testing. So concept testing is an early stage research method used to evaluate potential solutions before investing a lot of resources. You can use sketches or low fidelity prototypes, and this method can assess whether initial ideas might align with people's needs or their expectations. And so just by way of a non-Mozilla example, when Todoist was considering adding a Kanban board feature, they conducted a series of concept tests to get feedback on different approaches to visual task organization before they committed to full development. So we applied a similar approach for our work on browser choice. Regulators often fall back on familiar solutions like browser choice screens, even when it's not clear if they've been effective in the past. So we saw an opportunity to use concept testing to explore some new approaches. We worked with people throughout our organization, so including engineers, designers, product managers, to brainstorm some new ways to provide browser choice. We prototyped and tested some of the most promising concepts with over 100 Android users across 3 different countries. So I'm going to walk through 3 of these concepts with you today and share some of the insights that came out of this work. So we know from our research that it can be hard for people to compare different browsers, leaving many to just stick with the pre-installed default. So for this first concept, we wanted to explore better ways to connect people to the right browser for them. So in this example, a banner appears in the Play Store for a short quiz. And people select what's important to them in a browser, so things like device syncing or private browsing. And then they're matched with the browser that best suits their needs. We also know from our research that some people don't know how to change their defaults, and in some cases, they might not even know that it's possible to do so. So for our second example here, we wanted to explore how a dedicated default section of the Play Store might help. So in this case, a new defaults tab appears in the Play Store, and it shows a variety of essential app categories. So things like browsers, but also email and messaging. And people can view their current default, see what else might be available, and then set a new default directly from the Play Store. And then the last concept I'm going to show here, we also know from our research that when people do decide to download a new browser, the inertia of old habits can make it hard to fully switch. So, for example, if a pre-installed browser is prominently pinned to the hot seat, which I've pointed to here, people are likely to continue to reach for it out of habit. So for this concept, we wanted to explore ways that we might be able to change this habit for people. So when people choose a new default through a browser choice screen, the pre-installed default is removed from the hot seat and replaced with the new choice for easy access. And the previous browser is still available on the device. So what did we learn from this study? 3 key findings emerged from watching users interact with these concepts. First, choice must be offered in a context that aligns with people's expectations. If someone's visiting the Play Store or opening their browser, they likely have a purpose in mind. And interrupting them in the middle of their task does not put them in the right mindset to be making decisions about their software. Presenting choice interventions in contexts when people are already considering their settings, so maybe during device setup or at major updates, better aligns with people's expectations. Second, browser choice interventions need to help people make informed choices by helping them understand what a default is and providing ways for people to make different choices. And finally, the habit of using pre-installed default browsers can be really difficult to change. So we should make it much easier for people to explore and manage their default options beyond a single browser choice moment. So this study demonstrates that regulators should be testing remedies with real users early on before committing to a really specific remedy direction, just like tech companies test changes to their products before launching them. Behavioral experiments measure the impact of specific design elements by providing statistical evidence about how different implementations might influence user behavior. This is critical for remedy design because seemingly small details like placement or wording can have a really big impact. Netflix is known for using controlled experiments to test pretty much all of their proposed changes to their product. When they considered showing their full content library to entice potential customers before sign up, they ran an experiment to help test this assumption. And despite believing that browsing content would encourage signups, they were surprised to discover that a simpler experience actually led to better results. We used a similar approach to learn more about browser choice screens. We know browser choice screens have failed to have an impact in the past, but we wanted to understand if they're actually a bad remedy or if they'd simply been designed poorly. So we created the first high-quality public data on browser choice screens through an innovative experiment. 12,000 people in 3 different European countries were asked to step through a realistic desktop or smartphone setup flow and then respond to some questions about that process. People were randomly assigned into different treatment conditions, allowing us to test a variety of ideas on a large scale. We varied the designs in 4 primary ways. When people saw a choice screen, the number of browsers shown, the order of those browsers, and the amount of information that we provided about those browsers. So as an example, this was our high information Android screen. In this case, there's an introductory page that explains what a browser does and what a default is. Next, there are 12 browsers displayed in a randomized order, split between 2 groups based on market share. And we also included information like product descriptions and ratings without requiring a drop-down menu to view them. We learned that choice screens can be effective, but only if they're really well designed. So in order to be effective, browser choice screens should include key information, present a wide range of browsers, address ordering effects, and be shown at device setup or major updates. When people were shown a choice screen during device setup rather than browser first use, they were twice as likely to choose an independent browser over the pre-installed default. This finding demonstrates the importance of grounding any prescriptive remedy guidance in empirical evidence. When well-designed, a choice screen can align with people's preferences, increase people's satisfaction, increase browser contestability, and help people find a default that they intend to stick with. So over half of the control group, and these are the people that did not see a choice screen at all in the experiment, said that they expected to change the default browser that had been selected for them. On the other hand, 98% of the people who selected a browser through a choice screen expected to remain with it. This suggests that pre-installed defaults may not serve the needs or preferences of that many people. So this experiment demonstrated that design details matter. Simply requiring a choice screen isn't effective. It's important that regulators provide specific remedy requirements based on empirical evidence. And for the last method I'm going to talk about today, usability testing identifies gaps between interface design and user needs. So instead of just asking people what they think, we can actually observe what happens when they try to perform realistic tasks. This method can show us how proposed remedies function in practice, making it really valuable for assessing things like compliance. So for example, when TiVo was redesigning their website, they ran usability tests to help them identify issues. They discovered that users were skipping over important content because it looked to them like an ad. So these insights helped them to redesign this content before launching their new product. The DMA requires defaults to be easy to change. But what does easy even mean here? To find out, we watched 26 people try to change their default browser on both iOS and Windows and documented where they succeeded and where they ran into trouble. Our usability testing found 3 major barriers. Finding default browser settings was surprisingly difficult for people on both of these platforms. Windows users became lost in confusingly named categories, and on iOS, the settings were buried within individual apps, causing confusion when people were searching through more general menus. The search functionality on both platforms failed to help people find what they needed. On iOS, common search terms like default, browser, and internet returned either irrelevant results or no results at all. And Windows users faced similar challenges. Both platforms subtly nudge people toward their own browsers through the settings. On iOS, the browser settings actually disappeared from the menu when Safari was set as a default. You can see this on the left where the default browser app menu is not displayed. But on the right, when Safari is not selected as a default, the menu is displayed. And then on Windows, the prominent placement of a recommended browser setting feature, which serves to really just promote Edge, was often mistaken by users for the general browser settings that they were looking for. While most iOS users eventually succeeded in changing their default browser, many reported that the process was frustrating or confusing. Windows users faced even greater challenges. Several people either just gave up entirely or thought that they had successfully changed their default when they had not because they had accessed the recommended browser settings. So what should we do if we want to design better competition remedies? First and foremost, we should integrate user research throughout the development process, from early concept testing through implementation and monitoring. Just as tech companies would never launch a product without testing, we shouldn't implement remedies without understanding how people will actually interact with them. Second, we need systematic evaluation of remedies. It's not enough to just require remedies. We need to evaluate their effectiveness over time. This means requiring that gatekeepers conduct and share user research results and building in mechanisms for ongoing assessment. Third, remedy requirements should be based on evidence about user behavior, not just broad principles or technical specifications. We need clear standards for successful implementation based on measurable user outcomes. Fourth, instead of falling back on previously attempted approaches, we should explore new solutions and consider complementary interventions that work together. And then finally, we should work to foster collaboration with a wide range of stakeholders. This might mean establishing mechanisms for early feedback, consulting on research methods, sharing results, and providing access to testing environments. By working together, we can create more effective remedies. So the tech industry already knows the value of user research, and it's time that we brought the same rigor to our competition remedies. Thank you for listening.
And she beat you.
Alex.
Another intro.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last speaker of the day. Thank you very much for the invitation. So what I wanted to talk to you about is a project that we are and I do this project with two colleagues, Giorgio Monti from the University of Tilburg, a colleague of Rizzo, and Richard Fisi. And what we are trying to do in that project is to interview the main stakeholders which are involved in the DMA process, and some of the interviewee are in the room, in fact. And we are trying to see how, we have 1 year, you were recalling that, or less than 1 year of implementation, how it goes in a way. And so we have interviewed some gatekeeper, some business user, some civil society organization, and the European Commission too, okay? And we did that because clearly process matters a lot. I mean, this is something which is maybe not enough studied by the economists, but you may have the best rule of the world. If you don't have a right process, it will not lead to anything. And I think the last presentation is a very proof of this. And so this is why we were thinking that studying that process is important. So if we can go to the next slides, and I mean, there was someone mentioning, Joel mentioning that things can be complicated. And indeed, I mean, to enforce the DMA, this is a complicated process, because contrary to what has been said before, many of the rules are not self-explanatory, okay? And so what we would like to show here, and what we do hope, is that it will, the enforcement of the DMA will not end up as a Sisyphean task, which is tireless but useless, okay? And I have this quote by Albert Camus that our French colleagues surely know, which is maybe we should imagine that Sisyphus, by only doing that, should be happy. But I think we should hope for more than just this painful task which doesn't lead to result. And this is why we were studying process. So I first want to give you the feedback we had from the interview, and then from that the recommendation that we have to improve the process. So if we can go to the next slide, the third things right. Okay. Sorry. I didn't see that. The interaction between the players involved, and here you have a lot of bilateral interaction between the Commission and the gatekeeper on the one hand, and between the Commission and the business user, so the access seeker, if you want, or the civil society on the others. What our study shows is that there is when the Commission is interacting with the gatekeeper, the seven big tech, they in fact are, first they have different culture, because you have to know, for the one who doesn't know how it works in the Commission, there are two departments in the Commission which are involved. One is the antitrust department, and the other one is the let's say digital department, okay, a more regulatory department. And it seems that the logic of the antitrust department still prevails. So in a way, they implement the DMA in an antitrust manner, by having first discussing with the dominant company, the gatekeeper in this sense, then discussing remedy, and then market testing them with the business user and the civil society, instead of putting everyone on the table. So I guess, Cham, you will tell us how you did when you were opening the telecom network. But I think that we think in the report, and we will come back in the recommendation, that to have those kind of staged process, when you discuss first with the gatekeeper and then you go to the business user, maybe not the best way. The second thing that come from the interview is that the Commission at this stage, at least, is very reluctant to signal anything, to signal what the gatekeeper are doing is good or is not good, to signal what kind of enforcement strategy they will follow, whether they will go for an informal dialogue or for a formal non-compliance procedure. So, the Commission still is very reluctant to signal anything. And if you go now on the gatekeeper, what we notice is very different strategy, So some are more accommodating than others, some are very legalistic and more legalistic than others. So it's interesting that they don't behave in the same way, with the Commission. The dialogue with the business user and other stakeholders, so civil society organization, and we have several here in the room, or consumer protection organization, and so on, clearly less intense than with the gatekeeper. And also what is interesting is that there is very little coordination among the business user, which may lead to some problem, in the context of the self-preferencing and Google, Google says, and I think that's true. I mean, they say the hotel wants that we do something, the online travel agency wants we do another thing. So, what should we do at the end of the day? And the Commission doesn't take really a stance in that. So, I mean, that makes the work also of the gatekeeper sometimes complicated. And then in terms of multilateral dialogue, so to have everyone around the same table, to have the gatekeeper, the business user, the European Commission, that nearly never happened, So you had some open workshop where, the gatekeeper was supposed to explain what they were doing, but that was very scripted. I mean, it was extremely boring. I don't know if you have listened to it, but I wouldn't advise you to do it. But, because it was very scripted, so you knew what they would say. So I don't think it was really useful, but okay. And then there is these things that we know from the literature. There is a fear factor from retaliation of this, in particular, the small business users who are afraid that if they ask something in front of the Commission against a gatekeeper, they will lose every access, and in the time they will be bankrupt. Okay, so I think that's where it is coming from the interview on the interaction. On the use of formal tool, and there are a number of formal tools which are provided in the DMA to help, the implementation. We have first a number of internal compliance tools that the gatekeeper should set up. They have to have a compliance officer, but from the interview, the role of the officer seems to be extremely limited. Many business users don't even know who they are, and they are not very visible inside and outside the firm. So clearly, I mean, this potentiality is not exploited so far. And then the gatekeeper have to produce annually a compliance report, so they have to explain what they have changed because of the DMA in their product every year. So the first version of the compliance report have been published in March last year, and the second version should be published in March this year. Many people say they are not very informative, and also they are not published on a continuous basis. So yes, they do a change. If they do a change between the first version and the second version, this is not announced in the compliance report. And the worst thing, I think, is that they are not standardized. So you cannot really compare and benchmark, whether this gatekeeper is behaving better than this other gatekeeper. And then finally, the Commission has a number of enforcement tools. The Commission can have informal dialogue with the gatekeeper, can have, can specify through a decision what a specific obligation means, and the Commission is about to specify some interoperability obligation in the context of Apple, as it was mentioned before, or it can go to a non-compliance process. Now, the relationship between those three tools are not very clear, and it's not very systematic, at least at this stage. As I said before, the Commission do not come with a clear, acceptable compliance measure. So very often the gatekeeper do not know. So Fina, you were mentioning this morning, and it's true that the DMA, is setting up the burden of proof to the platform. It's up to them to comply. But sometimes, it's not clear whether it's compliance or not, and the Commission is extremely reluctant to say, yes, that's okay, or yes, that's not okay. Okay, and then there is no clear, at least public prioritization strategy from the Commission. Maybe they have one internally, but it's not public. Okay, so this is what we have noticed. So it doesn't mean that everything goes wrong, not at all. But clearly, we are in the first year, so it's une phase d'apprentissage, as we could say, a learning phase. So it's normal in a way that everyone is experimenting also for this and testing. But no, I think it's about time to probably improve the process. In particular, because the DMA was supposed to be complicated, but given the new geopolitics, it's clearly even more complicated, because now you really have a battle between the ex-papal mafia, or still the papal mafia, and the European Commission. And this debate will be, or this battle, which is a battle of business model, but also a battle of value now, will clearly not be an easy win for the European Commission. So what we suggest in the draft paper is 4 things to work on 4 elements. First is to improve transparency and in a way to have a better information level playing field, because it's clear that as always in regulation, you have an asymmetry of information between the regulatee and the regulator. And so you have to try to work on that asymmetry. And for that, we think that much more multilateral meetings, so between the Commission, the gatekeeper, and the business user, instead of having staged dialogue, staged bilateral dialogue, is absolutely key. So basically, you have to apply to have a regulatory approach to a regulatory instrument and not an antitrust approach to a regulatory instrument. Second, we need to have much better compliance reports, which are more comprehensive and which are coming with a standardized list of indicators, so we could know, for instance, you could say how much, your interoperability has been taken up by a business user, or how much data have been imported by your user, and you could then benchmark the gatekeeper, and you could see whether some are performing worse than others. The second thing to improve is predictability. We know that in regulation, legal predictability is absolutely key. And at this stage, we have still a lot of things which needs to be more predictable, the priorities, the concrete objective that the Commission wants to achieve. So we know that the DMA is about contestability and fairness, but we don't necessarily know for each core platform services, what exactly does it mean? What really the Commission wants to end up with, Again, if you take the parallel in telecom, I think it was clear where the telecom regulators in the US and in the world wanted to go. Here it's not always clear where the regulator want to go. And then, and that one will, what will follow from the other, have more clarity on the content of the obligation and what is acceptable as a compliance measure. And finally, we should also improve trust. Now, this is, I must say, something I didn't anticipate that much, but the trust issue when you have a European Commission regulating US firm is much more complicated when you have the European Commission regulating a European firm or the US authority regulating a US firm. Because, at the end of the day, the regulator and the regulatee have not studied at the same university. I guess, you probably have studied in the same university as the one you are regulating. Everyone was at Yale or Harvard and so on. That's not the case here, but that makes the things really much more complicated, because there is not a kind of implicit trust between the crowd here, and I think it has become even worse since 2 weeks, as we know. So I think we have to try to improve trust first and foremost by non-politicize the process. It's clearly politicized on this side now, on this side of the Atlantic, but it should not be on the other side of the Atlantic. I must say that I'm not totally optimistic on that from what I see today in the Commission, but okay, we will hear more about that tomorrow. Or we will not hear about that. I suggest it's better that you talk to them privately, not publicly. So maybe we should not have the public conversation, because we know what they will say. But privately, it may be different. And also what is very important is that you protect the right and the expectation of the gatekeeper and the business user in the process. I think that's very important to instill a little bit of trust. And then in terms of institutional framework, we think that, instead of having two departments with two different culture, implementing the DMA, so the DG Competition and DG Connect, you may try to merge them into a big department for big tech. And also you have to probably improve the division of work between the European Commission, which is the federal regulatory authority, if you want, and the national authority, in particular National Competition Authority, which still have a role to play, but the role is not very clear, So some, in particular the Dutch authority and Fiona organized an important conference in June last year, which was a kind of advocacy conference, and I think it's very important that the national agencies do that because they are closer to the field, if you want. So basically, I think a smart way of dividing the work is that the Commission will be the interface of the gatekeeper and the national agency will be the interface of the business user by having advocacy campaign as it was done in June, or by dealing with complaint. Now, on the longer term, I think we really need to completely rethink the institutional system we have in Europe, because next to the DMA, a lot of other laws have been adopted with a lot of other regulators, and they are not always very well coordinated. So I think what at the end of the day, what we need to set up is a European system of digital regulators. Modeled with what we have done for financial supervision, with the European system of central bank, where you have at the top, an independent and strong federal authority, the European Central Bank in the case of financial supervision, but it could be a new European digital authority, and then a strong relationship with the national authority, which come in a way in support of the work of the European institution. Okay, so those are this one is clearly for later. I mean, I think we have first to improve the process, and then we can go to the institutional framework. But those are our recommendation at this stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alex, and to all of our panelists. I would just like to make one point here, ladies and gentlemen. You have just seen 3 presentations that did not use any Greek letters. And kudos to our presenters for their ability to speak in English. In English, as the recovering regulator on this group up here, I'm reminded that who was it? Was Woody Allen's comment that life is 80% showing up and regulating is 80% implementing. And we've got a group here who can talk with us about implementing. The development of the policy is crucial, but it goes nowhere if it's not implemented well. And to establish that, I would just point to the last 3 weeks in the United States of America. But let me ask the panel writ large. We hear 2 things over here about the implementation of the DMA. One is that the politics of Europe are changing. The Draghi report was pretty hard on regulation as a reason for a bunch of European problems. And the second is that the tech bros, or Alex, what you call the PayPal mafia, are pushing this administration to retaliate against what exists today in the DMA, let alone what may come about as a result of the response to the original compliance reports. And any of you want to comment on the reality that you see with the DMA, Alex?
So first, I want to
I wanted to push back strongly against this idea that Draghi is against the DMA. He's not, and his report is very clear that what Draghi is against is about regulation which is not well calibrated. Okay, so regulation which are not proportionate or things like that. But he's very clear in his report that he's for a very forceful enforcement of the DMA. Why? Because the DMA is a way to open the ecosystem that Friso was mentioning to promote innovation. So it's a pro-innovation law. I mean, it's a liberalization law. You know, I like to compare, you know, the DMA with the end of the communism in a way, you know, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. You know, it was a way to liberalize the people. So, and it's not easy, you know, and you know, you have to change social norm also. So it will take time, but that's what it is, you know. So I think that the Draghi is not at all against the DMA, is against badly calibrated regulation.
Let me push. Okay, let's just have the. So I read the report. I agree. He particularly was focusing on the variations, regulatory variations within the EU and the impact of that. However, it has been seized on by all of the anti-regulatory forces. And my question is really about the anti-regulatory forces in the EU and the anti-regulatory forces in the United States. And I think we see them coming together is my concern.
I would say for me, the people mafia, or they are the crazy libertarian that you had in the Silicon Valley. We never had those kind of people in Europe. You know, so I wouldn't say that they are the same crowd or they share the same value, you know. And in a way, you know, the alliance between Trump and them, in fact, is maybe less surprising what we think, because both of them are libertarian and both of them are disruptor. So, you know, they share at least those common.
But
so, and we don't have that in Europe.
But it manifests itself in anti-regulation.
Right.
Right. Okay. Now let's deal with that. Okay. So Friso, you want to jump in here, or you?
Yeah,
I don't want to.
I mean, hard to predict the future, but I think what I took away from Draghi was indeed better calibrated regulation. I think he wasn't such a fan of regulation that targets every company, like the GDPR does, for example. Implicitly, he sort of kind of came out against that, and it might be time to rethink that. Yeah. Still a political report, so there's always some qualifications. But so I think maybe there's an alliance to be found there between the US and some forces in the EU that will take that to heart. For DMA, I'm more optimistic. I mean, I don't think we'll see it being more strongly enforced. But then again, it hasn't been. I mean, there's investigations, but nothing happened yet, right? So it's hard to really benchmark it against previous enforcement versus future enforcement, because yeah. So yeah, I guess I'll end up on that. I stay optimistic. I hope the DMA doesn't become a tool, as been suggested by at least someone in the commission, to, I mean, much in the way that, you know, antitrust is now a tool for China to push back against tariffs with new investigations into Google and Apple. I mean, the DMA definitely shouldn't become a tool, I think, in that war. Probably because it's also not very fit to be used in that way. But yeah, let's just hope for consistent enforcement, I suppose.
So I want to come back to Gemma in a second here on the structure, how the DMA might function. But the second part of the issue that I raised earlier was the rumbling here of tariffs being used against the EU in response to such things as the DMA, and the rumblings coming out of Europe in the last 48 hours. We're prepared to use extraordinary measures against the tech industry in the United States if that happens. So two questions. Are we headed to a digital trade war over a digital trade war? And secondly, I know how to run a trade war for hard goods. How do you run a trade war in a digital world for soft goods? maybe those laughs are that you know how to do it.
Yeah. I do think you have to push back against tariffs because, as we've seen for Canada and Mexico, it's sort of worked if those tariffs were ever serious and not just a bargaining chip in a wider weird conflict. But what are the tools for that, especially in when it comes to soft goods? I don't know. I mean, is it easier to weaponize the DMA than say antitrust for that purpose? Maybe, but probably the answer should be sought somewhere completely, somewhere else entirely, in intellectual property. But I'm not an expert on that, so I wouldn't want to be able to say how. Of course, just other tariffs, I guess. Maybe specifically tariffs on tech in a way, but how does that work? To your question, because I guess maybe you want to hit the where it might make an impact. I guess that was also the idea with the Canadian tariffs on things like things produced in red states, I suppose. Bourbon, right? So that was the example. So maybe tech is a place where it matters, but yeah, I wouldn't know how.
Alex, you want to, and then I'm going to go to Gemma for a question and come back then to everybody else.
No, but I mean, I think first, Europe, of course, has a big weakness is that we don't have a lot of digital infrastructure of our own. Okay, and what is happening now is clearly, I think, for Europe, we realize that we are too dependent from the US, and we should do something about it. So, I mean, it's a wake up call. I hope it will be taken up by Europe because I think clearly we were depending too much from the US company on digital, and some of them are. I don't know if you have read also the communique of the ECB on the digital euro, because we realized that we cannot depend also for the payment system of the US. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is on the war, I think the DMA is a tool to open for innovation. It's not anything else. So I think it would be bad to use the DMA for another objective, like a retaliation mechanism or a tariff mechanism or whatever. I mean, the DMA is not a redistribution tool. It's not that. I mean, the idea is not to redistribute the rent from the gatekeeper to the European business user. It's to open them up. Okay. So I think but there is a risk that in the current context, the DMA will be implemented in a different manner, but I think it would be bad for both sides. And the last thing I would like to say is that since a very long time there is this idea of creating of taxing better the digital company to have a kind of digital tax, and now we were a bit waiting what the OECD will do, but it may come back, it may come back vividly if a trade war is launched.
Okay. Gemma, have you had conversations with the EC about your approach? And if so, what kind of feedback have you heard? Question one. Question two is your approach applicable to the broad scope of issues dealt with under, we're only talking about the DMA here, but also the DSA, such as data and access to it?
Yeah, so we have presented various research to the EC, and those I think have been really productive conversations. This has not been said to me, but I think some of our browser choice screen research really helped kind of raise the floor of what the expectations might be for a browser choice screen. I think that in some of those conversations, I tried today to sort of explain that there's a big range of potential research approaches to evaluating remedies. Obviously, a really large experimental study is really great evidence for very specific things that we'd like to see. But I don't think everything has to be a really huge study. I think we can learn a lot by doing small things that might end up leading into sort of a larger investigation. And so, for example, I mean, just very, very basic usability testing. I mean, one of the most fundamental user research concepts, I think, can help us sort of understand the shape of what we're talking about in some of these regulations. I think that sometimes people respond to suggestions around that with some concern that, a small sample size, let's say, is not something that can be useful in these conversations. But I think that any sort of evidence to inform these conversations is really helpful. And I think as a starting point, understanding where a large number of people seem to be running into problems, for example, with a user experience, that can be a really helpful beginning to understand what might need to happen before we move into these larger experimental studies that are really testing like small refinements, design, very specific design changes, trying to decide between, two different types of implementation. So I think that there's maybe less of an appetite for those, say, smaller studies, but I still think they have a really strong place here, and I'd like to continue advocating for them, even if they're maybe not as well received.
Can you juxtapose what you're talking about with the idea of a regulatory sandbox?
Can you explain that term a little bit for me?
Regulatory sandbox and the ability to go test a regulation, much like you're talking about testing the concepts behind the regulation.
I mean, I think that depending on sort of the specific sort of regulation we're talking about, there are different ways to approach that. I mean, I think that one of the points I tried to make is that I think we need to have like a broader sense of who is a stakeholder in these conversations. I think people like my organization, for example, could come together and help kind of influence how some of the testing is happening, some of the sort of outcome metrics we're looking to see. But yeah.
Okay. All right, you've got a great group. But Fiona is standing here. She's been the last 5 minutes. She has a twitch or we have the microphone for Fiona.
Well,
Oh, I'm sorry, Laura.
it's a quick one. I
You
promise.
just need to be twitching.
Gemma, I like your entire presentation just looks to me like an incredibly strong argument for why we cannot have a behavioral remedy that involves a user interface. That is so affected by implementation that just practically speaking, it seems unworkable. And I guess like I'm curious, one, do you agree with that? Or like, do you think there would be something like, like an EC, I love this idea of like a EC big tech department. I love that. But like, do you think there's a version of that could possibly work? Or do you think, if we ever this is just a lesson that if we hit a problem like that we need to focus much more on structural remedies?
I don't think I have an opinion on like behavioral versus structural, but I do believe that that research can sort of help us get to a better place. But I think it requires that we are very clear on what the goals are of the regulation. At least from where I sit, I think sometimes some of these remedies, the goal of them is not necessarily clear to me, or at least could be made much more clear. I think if we can come to some agreement on what outcomes we're sort of expecting from these remedies, it becomes much easier then to be able to use research to get there.
Can I just say one thing on that? I fully agree that we need indicator for outcome. And, in the whole work we have done at SARE, SARE is a group of, the steering committee, we have some big tech, we have some small tech, we have some national regulatory authority. But one thing which struck me is how much the big tech were pushing back against those indicators. So I think that's a good sign that we need to have them, exactly as you say.
Fiona.
I wanted actually to build on that same thing. It feels to me like the way you could make this work a little better would be if there was a requirement that compliance meant that the platform had followed the recommendations of some kind of group of civil society experts like yours. And I don't know quite how to constitute such a group, but make that thing. And it has standards, and here are 6 different ways you can do something, and here are best practices, and so on. And maybe even we've got a panel of experts, and you can't choose which one because we don't want you doing that, but you can say, send me an expert from your pool who will review my choice architecture and all the experiments that I ran and give me a grade of how well I did. And that gets around the regulatory sandbox problem because the platform has all the data and the capabilities. They just that needs to be part of the proof of compliance. And I just feel like civil society knows the answer to this, and we're somehow not leveraging that. And then the second thing I just wanted to ask of Alex is, at this Dutch competition event that Alex mentioned before that I helped to organize, they had to ask twice as many business users to, or more, to speak as actually did because of fear. They were, these small entrepreneurs and smaller and medium-sized businesses were afraid. They were afraid to come and talk about what was happening. And so I think the multilateral environment is how do you protect them in that world? And the bilateral, where those businesses go in and talk to the commission about what's not working, the companies, the platforms have rights to know who's complaining about them. So effectively, the commission cannot keep them anonymous. So then you can't know if data portability is working because the people trying to use the data portability can't come in and complain, because if they tell you, then they're outed to the platform. And if they don't tell you, you don't know. So I feel like this is a very big legal problem that it would be great to find a solution to.
No, I think the fear factor apply for the smallest business user, but less for the big one. And so I think what you can do is with those kind of multilateral meeting to have the big one around the table, or the civil society which have those standard or those process in mind to have a good remedy. So I think that that's what I would, but clearly that would not be sufficient, but that it would be better than what we have now. And for the smaller one who doesn't want to talk and doesn't want to be on the table, there is some possibility to have some confidentiality protection. But the problem indeed, and there I would have to investigate further, is how far the commission can use in a file an information, a confidential information. I think they cannot use that, but they could still have a kind of informal feedback, I would say. But I mean, that's we can ask that to Philomena tomorrow. But I think there are groups of business users who have not, or civil society who have not those fear factors, and I will start with them, you know. And then, you know, you would have already a first stage of better remedy, and then in a second stage you go to the smaller one.
Okay, but let me just go back, you know, as the former regulator here, this is the transparency conundrum, okay? Because you want to have a transparent government. You want to know that the big guy is coming in to try and sabotage this competition over here. You also, in the same structure, need to know what the little guy is saying and have transparency here. And this is one of the huge governing challenges of a free and open societies. How do you create the kind of open dynamic of discussion that is necessary? And I don't think we've solved it, and I don't think that the EU has solved it yet. But go on, we're getting the 5-minute signal. Okay, somebody where are we? Sir, yes, sir.
Yes. So I just wanted Friso to talk a bit about the entanglement. I mean, it's kind of an interesting theory, but I wonder how much of the lack of competition or is a result of entanglement, and how much is just business decisions and that it's just difficult. I mean, we saw the challenges of, you know, Bing competing in search with Google. You know, so maybe Apple would have the same challenges and would rather make money, 10 billion, not to bother trying, and might not try even if they weren't being paid. And of course, they've been trying to get into, you know, an operating system for many years. I'm wondering how much of it is really the entanglement.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I don't have a good answer. I think we'll find out maybe over time, because now indeed you'd have to, I mean, redevelop the Chrome browser, redevelop your Play Store for the EU market only to enter into that competition. And maybe that's, I mean, it's a pretty big market, but maybe somehow not enough to make it worth your while. I guess as platform regulation spreads in more and more countries, Japan, South Korea, I guess not the US anytime soon, but as the market gets bigger where you can enter other ecosystems, I guess the incentive to do so just economically becomes larger. And then if that continues not to happen, I guess that would be a sign that something else is going on, perhaps that entanglement. On the other hand, yeah, if there's an economist who can put this in a nice model somehow and then get add some Greek letters and get a better feel for how much is depends on entanglement or other factors, that would also be great. So open invitation.
But I would, so as I read Briscoe's paper, which is an excellent paper, I kept thinking of AI and the entanglements that are being woven as we speak with AI, and how we have failed to deal with them in the first digital era, and now we need to deal with them in the second, or whatever we're going to call the AI era, but we've yet to follow your advice in the first era, which leads me to worry about the second. Okay, well, that's one more question. Last question. Yes, sir.
Oh, I was going to build on the question. What we see in the US, certainly in the regulatory context, is the small businesses can lobby together through trade associations, and that's a lot of what, as Tom knows, that's what big industry does very well as well. What are the barriers to that in Europe, where you can get the smaller industry players to anonymize themselves by working through a trade association, so it's not coming back at them?
Yeah, I mean, that's one way, and that's what they are trying to do. But those business users are new. The DMA is new, so I don't think there are a lot of association. Yeah, I mean, they are creating themselves now, but I mean, it's relatively new. And but that's clearly one way to go. The second thing I would like to say is that very often in those associations, you don't have, the people which are on the ground, the engineer who knows the stuff. So, I mean, yes, they are good at lobbying for policy, for law, but not that good, I think, from my experience of, when you go on the technical thing or what you were describing. That's in general not what I see in those kind of lobbying or trade association.
Let me just add one thing there. As a former trade association head and a regulator.
Not at the same time.
Not at the same time.
But no, no, in those times you could do it.
People did make the accusation.
I think now with the new government, you could accumulate without any problem.
The challenge in a trade association is you spend 80% of your time developing a position you're going to advocate in the other 20% of your time. And that position ends up being built around the weakest link of the trade association. Okay. So the real voice that the regulator wants to hear can't hide behind the trade association. The folks who hide best behind trade association are the big companies, okay, who can agree this is what we're going to do and keep their name out of the news and have the Association of Widget Manufacturers take the heat. Okay, I lied. You get one last shot.
Just a minor comment. So as a former regulator now in civil society, I think in Brussels, the Commission is so new to regulating. Yeah. It's learning how to be an independent regulator. This means that it's also learning to be an assertive regulator. So there is this emphasis on regulatory dialogue all the time. And I think now, 1 year later, it's clear that's not working. There's a lot of malicious non-compliance. Really? So I have faith that it'll work out. I think political events have happened that have made that much more urgent. So hopefully the Commission will come back with some very clear actions that have to be very decisive, or else there'll be a real mess. And then you're into the whole domain of sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you for being the perfect benediction. Thank you, everybody. Alyssa, you want to?